that's okay with me. Uh, Brother Damien asked me to speak today because he is finishing his obligation with Florida Hospital. He's, I think, done with that very soon. And we thank the Lord for him and his faithfulness. You know, Brother Damien is a bivocational pastor. What that means is his only source of providing for his family is not just from this church. He's bivocational. But I think it's admirable and unique that what he's chosen to do outside of the doors when he's not here is still ministry. He's not a plumber, nothing wrong with that. And he's not a used car salesman, nothing wrong with that. He chose to use his craft, what God trained him to be. He's got his doctorate from the seminary to make his bivocation. Both vocations are serving the Lord. So he serves, as you guys know, I'm not telling you anything new, as a minister of the gospel in hospitals. He's bedside to many tragic times for people. He doesn't wear this on his sleeve and share it with you guys that much, but just in conversations, when I'm talking to him over lunch or something, he'll share with me about how he's able to lead someone to the Lord. He's able to lead someone to Christ. So he gets those opportunities often. Unfortunately, not yet, God, especially this year. We've not seen a lot of that in here, but I want you to know your pastor is faithful with the gospel. He presents the gospel on his job at the hospital, and he sees people come to faith in Jesus Christ, which excites me to hear, because he'll say it, and he'll just say it in an offhand conversation. I'm like, oh, that's great. That's awesome. He gets those opportunities. So pray for Brother Damien as he finishes his program with the hospital and his obligations there. But today, I'm going to speak with you, as I did a couple of weeks ago, but on a different topic. And hopefully the notes will follow here in a minute as they come up on the screen. But I'm going to talk to you about to be found faithful, what it means to be found faithful. When I think of faithfulness, there's a lot of things that come to mind. I think of people. When I think of pastors, I think of Brother Damien, and I'm appreciative for what he's shown in his faithfulness. I think of Billy Graham. Okay, everybody in this room, when I say Billy Graham, you know who that is instantly. He's still alive. And my wife and I have talked about this a few times. When Billy Graham finally passes on, it's kind of like the end of an era, the end of something special. There was so much evangelism and groundbreaking evangelism that took place, Billy Graham. He used whatever resources were there at the time. He was one of the first people to get out there and to get on TV and get out there and fill stadiums. And I think he wrote a book just a few years ago. He's on in his years. He's not healthy, so he's not able to as much. But there's a man who's been faithful his whole life, and it's been on display. In a difficult manner, he's been faithful. And I praise the Lord for that, because sometimes when you're watching a man who God has elevated, and when they fall, it's so tragic. And so I'm thankful for the faithful life of him. I'm thankful for the faithful lives and examples of fathers. My father, he's in there counting right there. I'm proud of my father. He's been faithful. My mom and dad, how many years are you from your 60th? You're close, 50-something. 59, almost 60 years. On their 50th anniversary, we had a 50s party at my house. And we had a house out in the country with a big pole barn, and we set it up with the theme of the 50s, and girls came out. They were relatives of ours. We had it all planned in poodle skirts, or was it that, or just 50s waitress apparel, and they would take orders, and we had burgers and fries, and we set up kind of a 50s diner. We had a whole theme to celebrate their 50th, and time has flown by, and now it's going to be bell-bottoms and peace symbols. I don't know. I don't think we're into that. Their 60th is coming up, and I'm saying all that to say, to me, watching them, it's been the epitome of faithfulness. That's been my example. My father's been faithful. He's been a faithful father to me. He's been there for me, there for all of his kids. There's 4 of us, and we've all been in different states at different times. I've been in Florida the whole time. But I'm thankful for a faithful father. Hopefully you can hear me in there. And we're going to have dinner tonight. So thank you, fathers. But what does it mean to be found faithful? I Googled it, right? That's what you do these days. You never think you'd hear the word Google in church, but if you Google the word faithful, this is what comes up. Loyal, constant, staunch, steadfast, resolute, firm in adherence to whatever one owes allegiance. Faithful implies unswerving adherence to a person or thing or to the oath or promise which a tie was contracted. It's pretty good. Covers it pretty well. That's Google, I think Wikipedia, I don't know which one it was, but I Googled it, and that's what came up. But what does it mean to be faithful? I think the best way to describe faithfulness in the church is not maybe to Google it, right? But to observe what it looks like in action. We can observe, I just gave you 2 examples of people in our generation, Billy Graham and my father, right? That was my 2 examples, people in action. Well, in this fallen world that we live in, the best examples of faithfulness probably are going to be found mostly in the Bible. We can read about real stories, real events, real people that actually happened, events that happened. There's mankind's faithfulness chronicled all throughout the Bible, or lack thereof, right? And then there's God's faithfulness all throughout. God's unwavering faithfulness all throughout. So we've got the pictures of faithfulness and what it looks like in the Bible. You don't have to turn to these first verses. We're going to actually park later on in Revelation 2:8, if you want to get prepared for that. But a couple verses I want to read to set the table. Deuteronomy 7:9 says, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God." Did you notice the redundancy there? Know therefore that the Lord, which is another word for boss or the one in charge or God, let's just replace it with God. Know therefore that God, your God, is God. So there's no other way to get it any higher than that, right? Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. So that's not there by accident. He's making a point. And this God, that's above all gods, that is God, the only God, he goes on to say, is the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. Psalm 36:5. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. As I read this verse, Andrew, I thought, you need to sing this. This is an old song. I call it old song. When I first started getting interested in contemporary Christian music, there was a band called Third Day. It was when I was working for AT&T. And I think this is some of the early stuff from the 90s. Your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens, stretches to the sky. That's where that song came from, Psalm 36:5. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness stretches to the clouds. David wrote Psalms to remind himself of the frailness of himself and the greatness of God, his weakness, but God's faithfulness. He reminded himself by giving, if you read Psalms, it's all throughout there. All throughout Psalms, he's reminding himself of who he is and his frailness and his weakness, and he's reminding himself of who God is and how God is faithful to him. I think that's what we have to do too. We take the example of David. And when we're going through a rough time and we're having moments of where we're feeling faithless and not faithful, we've got to remember, like David did, David wrote these things. Maybe you should write them down. Remember the things where God's been faithful. Remember the things where God has answered prayer. Remember the things when you're going through those tough times. Remind yourself the way that David did when he wrote all these Psalms, that God is faithful. He says in Psalm 36:5, your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens. This is one I just read. Your faithfulness to the clouds. By acknowledging God for who he was, it's therapeutic for us to do the same thing. Lamentations. If you read through that, it's kind of dark, isn't it? 3 chapters, is it? Lamentations 3:21 through 23. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast, here we go again with that word, steadfast. I think we've already used it, right? The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. And it ends with what? Great is thy faithfulness. So here's our picture of faithfulness, right? This is our best example of it. But lest we forget the context of this Lamentations, that little verse that I pulled out, it's a good refrigerator verse, right? Great is thy faithfulness. It's a nice one. It's encouraging to us. It's uplifting to us. I think it's used a lot for good reason. But let me remind you of the context of that scripture. If you read all of Lamentations, that's the only verse, those 3 verses really, that are semi-positive. They're very positive, but there might be a couple that hint a little positive. It's all very dark. It's all very, let me give you an example. I'm not going to read the whole Lamentations, but I printed out a page, and I just used a highlighter and underlined little phrases and themes to give you a feeling of what Lamentations reads like. What happened is Jeremiah, also known as the weeping prophet, was writing this. He wrote the book before it, which is Jeremiah, named after himself, and then he wrote Lamentations. And he was known as the weeping prophet because he tried to tell them, he tried to warn them all throughout Jeremiah. Lamentations is him lamenting the demise of the Jewish people. The desolation of their land, the desolation of their people. They lost everything. So Lamentations is written about that. So much of Lamentations chronicled the destruction of the Jewish nation. He describes it 10 ways to Sunday. There's a lot of repetition when you read it. He uses these phrases and euphemisms, and then he'll use them again and he'll say it a different way. It's almost poetic. It's written like a poem. And he'll just use different ways to say the same thing all throughout 3 chapters. Basically, woe is us. We are a mess, and we caused it ourselves. We did it to ourselves, and now we're this, and now we're hated, and now we're reviled. So he goes through it 10 ways to Sunday in these 3 chapters. But after he details with great pain what has happened to his people, that's when he acknowledges what he does in that verse. So I'm going to read you some of the highlights, or the lowlights, right, of Lamentation. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become. She weeps, I'm skipping ahead, I'm not reading in order here. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They've become her enemies. The roads to Zion mourn. Her enemies prosper. Her children have gone away captives before the foe. All her majesty has departed. Jerusalem has sinned grievously. Therefore she's become filthy. All who honored her despise her, for they've seen her nakedness. O Lord, behold my affliction, for my enemy has triumphed. All her people groan as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. And if you keep reading this, I won't read the rest. It goes on like circular about the sound of that throughout the whole thing. And at one point he talks about, we alluded to they sell their treasures for food. They search for bread. He talks about the ladies who once nurtured their children, preparing them to boil them up to eat. It's a really dark passage. And there's 3 chapters of that. So that's the context. So you get the idea. He's lamenting. That's why it's Lamentations. And he comes to this point where he says this in Lamentations 3:21 through 23. But he says all those things, it's dark, it's dark, it's dark, and all this desolation. And then he says, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Here he has hope in the midst of all this. Therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end, and they are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. How was he able to say that in the midst of all this ashen heap around him? Ladies preparing, can you think of anything worse? A formerly nurturing mother now has to prepare that child that she's nurtured to eat, not for them to eat, for them to be eaten. It's just crazy. When you read it, it's in there. I think it mentions it twice. So how can he, in the midst of all that, be able to say this? But he does. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Well, I'll tell you why. He got a special insight. He was the prophet who had all the answers before. They didn't listen to him. He knew God was not only a God to be feared, but a God who was merciful, a God who was long-suffering with Israel, with his people. And he knew he was a God of faithfulness. So Jeremiah knew this about him all along. So he didn't hold it against God. He knew this was God's judgment, and they deserved it. They had earned it. I'm so glad, though, that my salvation is not dependent upon how faithful I am to my covenants, aren't you? Our relationship with Christ is not dependent upon our faithfulness to any kind of commitment or covenant that we can make, that we've made with God his Son. No, rather that relationship is completely dependent upon God's covenantal faithfulness to his people, and his faithfulness is unwavering. Remember that definition I gave you from Google? I think they said unswerving. His is unwavering. A few weeks ago, I think in Life Group, you guys, we all went through it. The book of Revelation, the black book that we had, the workbook. We completed a few weeks this study on Revelation. And I love Revelation. When I found out those books were circulated, I was excited about it because I've read it a bunch of times through, and it's always intriguing, right? Because it's never the same twice. As you gain more insight and you get older and you hear other people say, well, this means that and this symbolizes this, you kind of process all that. And nobody really has all the answers to it because there's a lot of symbolism in there, and then there's some literal things. It's a mixed bag. There are some good books written on that that you can find. But I've always been intrigued by Revelation because there's a lot of mystery and shrouded symbolism in there, and I try to unpack it and figure it out. So I was excited when we had this Revelation study coming, and we went through it as a class in there. It's interesting. It reads so much different than the rest of the Bible, except for maybe a little bit of Daniel is similar to that. But even though it's filled with doom and gloom for some of mankind, it's a reminder of something. It's a reminder that our sovereign God is in control, but he's not just in control now, he's in control all the way to the end. Hence the word revelation. Well, revelation is the revealing of himself and his final plan. So Revelation is packed with information about that. That's why I love Revelation. It's interesting to read, and it's exciting to read as a believer because we know how it happens, what happens in the end. But it does read so much different, but it's a reminder at the end of the day that our sovereign God is in control all the way to the end. As I heard Dr. Tony Evans say the other day, everything that happens in our life has to sift through God's fingers. So no matter what, you think about all the bad things that can happen and the desolation that can happen in your life. We've not experienced half of some of the things that we just read about Lamentations and some of the things that we're going to talk about with Job. But we do have troubles that come our way. The Bible says we will. And we shouldn't be surprised when persecution comes. That's a whole other topic. But troubles will come our way because we live in a fallen world. We live in a sinful world. So we are going to encounter those things. But as Tony Evans put it the other day, he said, everything that happens in our life has to sift through God's fingers. So keep that in mind as the things that you consider bad things happening to me. Those things had to sift through God's fingers first. He had to allow it or control it or some way be involved in it or maybe even set it up for you because he has your end and your good in the outcome. He has a plan that includes all of his followers. He's set this is like the way I like to think of it. He's set the big egg timer in the sky. Those egg timers on the top of your stove, 60 seconds. He's set the big egg timer in the sky. And Revelation to me is a reminder of that. God has set the timer, and he knows when that bell is going to go off. He knows when that whistle is going to blow. He has a plan that includes all of us. Revelation gives us a glimpse of the end of that timer, what it might look like, what it's going to look like, what those end times are going to look like, what things have to take place. And a lot of it's confusing if you read it. And it's like, well, I don't understand how all this ties together. But he's revealing a little bit of himself there. He gives us a glimpse of the end times and a glimpse of that timer that he's set. And among many things, Revelation is a reminder to us that God is faithful. Faithful to judge. That's in Revelation, right? Faithful to avenge the blood of the martyrs. Remember the martyrs? They said, how long will we have to wait before you avenge our blood? And then he does near the end of the chapters. You see what he does at the end. And he avenges the blood of the martyrs, and he elevates them to a position of power in his kingdom to reign. So God is faithful to judge. He's faithful to judge avenge the blood of the martyrs. He's faithful to his covenant with his bride, the church. The last couple of chapters talk about the unveiling of the bride, right? As it comes down. There's a lot of imagery described in Revelation. It tells about the new heaven, the new earth, this place that he's prepared for us, right? And it speaks of the new Jerusalem city coming out of heaven with its walls and foundations adorned with every special gem and stone. And I was talking to Miss Beryl about this a few weeks back. I said, did you know your name is in the Bible? And she said, yeah, somebody told me. And I shared with her this last verse. I think it's in chapter 21 or 22 of Revelation. He's describing the new Jerusalem as it's coming out of heaven. He's talking about the walls are this and that, and there's every precious gemstone in the foundations of it. And one of them was the stone Beryl. So she's in the Bible. So Revelation is also a reminder for us to be faithful. God's faithful to us. He's shown it throughout the Bible. He's shown it in Revelation, and it's a reminder for us to be faithful. So our main text today is going to be Revelation chapter 2, verse 8. Not just 8, but 8, 9, 10, 11. But we're going to start there. Revelation 2, verses 8 and beyond. But before we go there, I'm going to give you some highlights. I'm going to skip around a little bit in the chapters that are in Revelation. The writings in the first part of Revelation, if you guys remember your study, I have an advantage because we just had this study, right? So you guys know this stuff. So you could probably answer some questions, but I'm not going to open that up today. He gives critiques to 7 churches, right? In Revelation, he's speaking to John. He's asking, write these things down. And John's recording them. He sees them in a vision. He's caught up in the Spirit, and he's able to see these things, and he tells them to write them down. And he gives these critiques to these 7 churches in the front part of Revelation. He gives critiques to 7 churches. We're not going to name all the churches. We're going to focus on one of them. At the end of each critique, he makes promises. There's a common thread when you read that, his critique to the churches. He says these things, good or bad, about them, and at the end, he makes a promise to them. He says, I am coming soon. This is one of them. This is one of the promises. For example, in Revelation 3:11, Revelation 3:11, he says, I am coming soon. Hold fast what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God. Chapter 3, verse 19. Those whom I love, I reprove and discipline, so be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and eat with him, and he with me. The one who conquers, again, similar language, I will grant him to sit with me on the throne, on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. So you see what? He's equating the two. I conquered, and I sit on the throne with my Father, and those who conquer can sit on the throne with me. So here's a call, chapter 14, verse 12. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and keep their faith in Jesus. So there's some examples of God making promises to them all throughout Revelation, these 7 churches that he's addressing. So let's look closely at one particular church, and that's Smyrna, and that's found in Revelation 2, 8 through 11. So you can turn there with me if you'd like, or I'll just read it. This is written to the church in Smyrna. Now, a little about Smyrna, if you guys remember from your study, they probably all run together, so maybe you don't remember. Smyrna was the city that was a city that was a prosperous city. It was a port city. If you know anything about port cities, the reason that Putin wanted Crimea is because it's a port city. A lot of commerce comes in and out of port cities. They can become very rich and prosperous cities. So that's what Smyrna was. It was a prosperous city. It was a port city. A lot of trade ships came in and out of it. But you know what else? Something else unique that I read about it is they had fertile land. So not only did they make money off of the transit of merchandise back and forth, they had their own natural resources. They had very fertile land, so they were able to export their own goods. Very rich, very prosperous, very successful city. Beautiful buildings, church buildings adorned the place. But things were not all right in Smyrna. John is being told to write down this message to one of the 7 churches that he addresses in Revelation, in this case Smyrna. And this is where it starts, verse 8. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. So if you remember in your life groups when we studied this, the angel here represents who? You guys remember? The pastor. The pastors are the leaders of the church, and he addresses them all in that same way, these 7 churches. So that he's making this message, and he's asking John to write it down, and the message is written to the pastors, the leaders of the church. And then, in this case, he's talking to Smyrna. And he says, so the verse starts out saying, write the words of the first and last who died and came to life. Is that an unusual way to start it out? He's saying, write the words of the first and the last, the one who died and came to life. He starts out by declaring that these are the words of the first and the last. Other parts in the Bible, Alpha and the Omega, right? So it's important to note where that phrase comes from. You hear it a lot in the Old Testament. A lot of times it's translated as the Alpha and the Omega. It comes from Isaiah 41:4. You don't have to look it up. You can later. You can mark it down. Isaiah 44:6. And Isaiah 44:12 and 13 all use that reference about the first and the last. And that first and the last in the Old Testament, since Christ isn't here yet, is talking about God. The first and the last is God all throughout the Old Testament. Now there's a reference to the first and the last, and it's in Revelation. And he says, write down the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. Now, there's a second descriptor, right? He's using a description, the first phrase, and the last. That phrase is used by the Almighty God. We see that in the Old Testament. Then, Jesus Christ declares himself to be the first and the last. He is declaring that he is Almighty God. He picks the Old Testament designation of God and applies it to himself. We know this because of the second description, right? Where he says, the one who died and came to life. Well, God didn't die. God that we know as God incarnate in the flesh died. The one who died and came to life was Jesus. So, why did he do that? Well, it was a reminder to the reader that Jesus is God. If you've ever talked to some people, I've met people who believe in Jesus or say they do, and they believe in God, but they'll say, but I don't believe Jesus was God. Of course, there's all kinds of religions based on that fact, on that assertion. So he makes this point in Revelation to say the one who died and came to life is Jesus. So it's a reminder to the reader that Jesus is God. It's a reminder to his audience that he's writing to that these aren't the words of John, it's the words of God. And it's also something a little deeper. It's God displaying his deity, because he is God, Almighty God, and he's also displaying his humanity. I am Christ. So he's God, but he understands their plight. Why is that important? Because he's getting ready to say exactly that. What's the next verse say? He says, in verse 9, I know your tribulation and your poverty. So now it makes sense. Why is he talking about his deity and his humanity? Because he's trying to get them to understand, I'm God, but I also understand. I understand your plight. I know your tribulation and your poverty. Verse 9, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are synagogues of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Here's one of those promises. Remember the other Revelation instances of the churches? There was a promise that followed each end. This is the promise to Smyrna. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. What's the second death? The second death is final judgment, hell for those who have not received Christ. Well, this city was rich. We already talked about that. It was a port town. It had money. But why does he say, I know your tribulation and your poverty? Well, the city was rich, but it was a city that required all of its citizens to hail Caesar. Well, what's unique about Christians? They're not going to hail Caesar. So what happened to them during this time was political oppression. Persecution came later. And what would happen specifically to those who did not hail Caesar? What do you think happened? If I had a business and I made sandals, leather sandals, but I have to go to the government to get a permit to sell my leather sandals in the market, the government's going to deny my permit because they know I won't hail to Caesar. So that's the type of thing that would happen to them. There was political oppression. So even though this was a rich and prosperous city, the Christians who lived there were not rich. It was a rich city, but it required its citizens to hail Caesar as God. This was in direct conflict with the Christians who followed Christ. So when he says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, that's what he's talking about. But he does mention in parentheses, but you're rich. That's where he's talking about they're rich in spirit. Well, this was a rich city, as we said, but they were in poverty right in the midst of it. He knew there was a price tag to full commitment to him. And they experienced specific retribution from their faith in Christ. And he was letting them know, I'm aware of your poverty. I'm aware of the price tag that it's costing you to commit to me. So the believers who did not hail Caesar as God didn't partake in its success. They were penalized. I gave you a scenario where they probably weren't able to do business with everybody else. They couldn't succeed in business or trade. They were ostracized for their faithfulness and their unwillingness to bow. So throughout this letter, though this letter is sent to the church in Smyrna, Smyrna represents every persecuted church. In every age, in every persecuted believer, in every cultural setting. So that's why these scriptures are used so much. When we were studying it over there in the life group, as we're reading it, I'm saying, do you see our church, Claremont Central Church? I don't know if the discussion came up in any of your life groups. Did you guys ponder the thought, out of one of these 7 churches, do we fit any of them? Is Claremont Central Church any one of these? So that's what those verses are designed for, is to get you to look inwardly and see if you fit. But did you know that Smyrna and Philadelphia were the only 2 churches that received no criticism or call to repentance? In spite of their trials, they had remained pure in their belief and their behavior. Not only were they presently suffering, Jesus tells them that they're going to continue to suffer. That's in the verses coming up. But this word Smyrna, I looked this up, means bitter. The Greek word for Smyrna means bitter. And it's been said that the trials of life can make one bitter or better. For the Smyrna believers, their trials were making them better. God was commending them. He was telling them to keep the fight up, to not give up, to endure. I know your plight. I know your tribulation. But it's going to get worse, he tells them. He tells them it's going to get worse, and it does in the next verses. He tells them that. The Christians in Smyrna were getting hit from all sides. Their government, I told you about that. And then I did not read that, and we're going to get to that, where I guess we did read it. Let's read it again. I know your tribulation, your pride, but you are rich, and the slander, this is the part, and the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. What he's referencing there is the persecution they were receiving from other religious people. They were ostracized by the other religious people, by Jews who weren't followers of Christ. So they were getting hit from all sides, from their government, from the other churches who were not followers of Christ. And it gets worse. Their government, their churches that were non-believers, then he tells them it's going to get worse. But then he tells them, after he tells them it's going to get worse, he says, fear not. Fear not. Why does he tell them to fear not? I think they would tell you because they know he's the only one and true God, the sovereign God, and they want to make sure they identify with him because they know the history. Just like David chronicled the successes and the things that God had done for him, and that's what encouraged him to be faithful because God was faithful. They had similar stories of faithfulness that they could share with you. I could go around this room and we could probably take an hour or probably longer of you guys sharing with me stories where God's been faithful to you, miracles where God's been faithful to you. So these people had that in there, woven into their tapestry of who they were. So they did not fear. He's told them not to fear, but understanding the audience he was talking to, these were faithful believers. They were going to identify themselves with Christ, with God. They had made that choice. They'd accepted their lot in life, which if it meant to suffer, then that's okay. They knew that they served a God that was greater than their circumstances, and the greater reward was not in this life. So as I mentioned the last time I spoke from here, God uses detours. We talked about that, right? He uses detours in life, and he uses trials to fine-tune our character. But God is looking for the faithful. He's watching. He's looking for the faithful. And I'm going to read for you Psalm 101:6. He says, mine eyes shall be upon the faithful of the land, that they may dwell with me. He that walketh in a perfect way, he shall serve me. He was looking, right? He was looking when he found Job, but he found Job faithful. I'm not going to read the whole story of Job. It's a very famous story. It's a popular story, so I'm confident you guys know it. Job was the epitome of faithful, right? You guys know the story. His world crumbles around him. His friends leave him, and his own wife, his closest confidant, says what to him? Why don't you just curse God and die? So Job was the epitome of faithful. And I think his story is in the Bible to show us that it can be done. Because I don't think we go through what the people in Lamentations went through, or probably ever will in our lifetime, Lord willing, or have gone through a fraction of what Job has seen and gone through, what's chronicled in Job. And she says, curse God and die. Most of us aren't going to go through those things. But he was faithful, so therefore we can get the confidence that we can be faithful. Why be faithful? Be faithful because God is faithful. Here's another example. I'll call it faith in the furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This was one of my favorite Bible stories as a kid growing up because it gives such vivid imagery. And I remember, you guys, you know what flannel graph is? It's just a word used for basically a picture board. So in Sunday school, as it was called when I was little growing up, they had these boards made out of flannel, I guess. It wasn't flannel like a checkerboard. It was just the material, usually light blue or white. And they had these pictures, these images, these cutouts of Bible characters with this special material on the back that would cling to this flannel. Anyway, flannel board Bible stories. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was one of my favorites. And the flannel things would go up there and they'd tell the story, and the vivid imagery comes to it. This is one of those special stories in the Bible to me as well. Because I learned it and understood it as a young kid, but it resonates even now. Faithful in the furnace. I won't read the whole story, but I want to remind you of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar, here's how it starts. King Nebuchadnezzar gets a big head, right? He gets the God complex. Meanwhile, these three Jewish boys, whose names are changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these are Babylonian names that they're given. And Nebuchadnezzar gets this idea, he's going to make this golden image, and he wants everybody to bow down to this image, right? You guys know the story. These three guys worked for the king. They were liked by the king. They did a good job. They were some of his best workers. And the king says, we're going to put up this image and let it be known anyone who does not bow down will be thrown into this fiery furnace. Then what was their response? You guys know the story? They said, our God who we serve is able to deliver us. Well, first they didn't bow. Okay, then what happens? The king's minions come around. Hey, king, these guys are just, in your face. They're not going to bow. And he's like, what? Who? What? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are his boys, right? Well, here's what happened next. He says, our God who we serve is able to deliver us from your fiery furnace. In other words, we believe that our God is greater than your threat. And it's worth reading it from the text. So we'll do that. Daniel 3, from the second half of verse 15 through 18. Daniel 3, 15 through 18. I'm going to read the second part of 15. But if you do not worship, this is Nebuchadnezzar talking, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? What arrogance, right? He thought he was God. He thought he was a God, at least. And he wanted people to bow at his command. And then he says to them arrogantly, who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Well, verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But catch this next part. But if not, so they had a back door, right? But if not, if he chooses not to do this, if God chooses not to save us, but if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image which you have set up. Again they said, notice, but even if he does not, let it be known that we will not bow. Can we say that? These three boys were faithful. They were faithful in the face of peer pressure, right? Everybody else was bowing. Everybody else was doing something else contrary to what they were doing. So it was pretty tough. So they were faithful in the face of peer pressure. They were faithful in the face of persecution. They knew what was going to happen. He told them. He set it up for them. They were faithful unto death because they were willing to be cast in there. They said, if that's what happens and he chooses not to save us, then so be it. We're not going to bow. But we believe he will. They were faithful unto death. Well, does that theme, faithful unto death, sound familiar? It does, because we were just reading about it in Revelation. Back to Revelation 2, the second part of verse 10, the final part of this. He says, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So if you know the rest of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are joined by a fourth individual in the furnace, right? Described as one in the form of the Son of God. And what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He goes up there and he sees it, and he's astonished by it. They're not even singed. They're not even smelling like smoke when they come out. And there's a fourth individual with them, like the Son of God. What does he do? He removes them from the furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar subsequently promotes these three men, elevates these three men to a higher position. And what does he do next? He acknowledges their God by decreeing that anyone speaking against their God would be torn from limb to limb. What a turn of events, right? So even if we have figurative furnaces in this life, I don't think any of us are in fear of being thrown into a literal furnace by a government official. But even if we have figurative furnaces, things that we're going through that are troubling, things that we're going through that are legitimately hard and difficult, if we're faithful, as he gave us the example, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego gave us the example, not to bow to the pressure, not to give in, he'll be with us in that fiery furnace. So remember, God has set the clock. Remember my egg timer I talked about? God has set the clock. We're to be faithful until the bell dings, right? Faithful until the whistle blows. I had a coach in high school, Neil Hatfield. My dad knows him. Neil Hatfield was his name. He was not only, we went to a small school, so the coach was everything. Multitask. They got a lot for their money, right? He was the football coach. He was the janitor of the gym. He kept the floors cleaned. I don't know if they made him, he was the Bible teacher. And in this case, he was the youth pastor of the church. And he coached every sport. So he coached if we played baseball. He coached if we played football. Coached if we played. He had to wear all these hats. His name was Neil Hatfield, but he was more than a coach of football during this time period for me. He was our youth pastor, and a lot of what he taught us on the field, out on the practice field and the game day field, was directly correlating with our walk with Christ. In other words, the things that he would tell us out there on the field, there was a common theme with what he told us on Sundays during youth group time. Being faithful till the whistle blows. That comes to mind because literally that's something we did in the drills in practice. When it was 100 degrees outside in Pine Hills, jogging to practice field. If you guys know, I'll tell you where I went to school. Tabernacle Baptist Church, right on the corner of Powers and, is it Powers? Powers and Highway 50. There's a McDonald's that's been there, Paul Street. There's a McDonald's that's been there forever. Yeah. The McDonald's that's been there forever, and the white church up on the hill on the side. That's where I went to school. That's where I graduated. And we didn't have our own field. They still don't have a field. So we would jog with our full gear on, with the helmet on. It was mandatory. Helmet on, full pads. We would jog from the school, from the gym, locker room. It's 100 degrees, feels like 110 inside your helmet. Run from there to Robbinswood Elementary School field. That's where we practiced. And sometimes we would be driven by a bus to the fairgrounds and practice on the fields over there. So there's the setting. You can get the imagery of it if you're near that area. And 120 degrees in the helmet, right? We're tired, we're sore. We had to run to practice and then practice. And when we did practice behind the gym, it was with sand spurs and sand, and it was hard. But it was fun, and I didn't know till looking back as an adult, man, that was really crazy. That was hard. But we felt invincible, right? We were young. And he pushed us, and he pushed our limits. But in that 100-degree weather, 120-degree weather, inside my helmet, we were tired, we were sore, and he would yell while we're doing our sit-ups, and he's walking by stepping on our stomach, "Never quit." He would scream at us, "Never quit." And it wasn't abuse. We all took it. We were guys, and we felt like this is boot camp, this is training, this is making us tough. And he would scream at us, "Never quit." And he'd have us jog in place, and he would scream at us, "Never quit." So what tended to happen over time is we'd yell it back. And then it became this thing among us. He would say it to us, and we'd yell it back in unison. "Never quit." So then something else that he started doing. We would do these drills. He'd say, "Run in place." Now, it wasn't a run in place where you just trotted. It was a run in place where your knees had to be, and he would demonstrate. And he goes, "No, I want to see your knees up in the air." And he's like doing this animated, jacking his knees up in the air. And, of course, he's not in full pads. He's in sweatpants and a T-shirt and a whistle. And he's showing us how he wants us to run in place. And so we got to run in place in this extremely animated, full range of motion way. And he said, "I want you to do it until the whistle blows." And we'd stand there and run in place. And he'd come and scream in your ear if you weren't doing it the right way. And somebody would get tired and they'd stop. And he'd say, "No, the whistle didn't blow." And he'd say, "The whistle hasn't blown. Do it until the whistle blows." And he would kind of not taunt or torment, because we didn't take it this way. We took it as training. But there were also times where he'd have us run sprints on the football field. I remember this specifically happened to me out at the fairgrounds field. He says, we're going to do the hash marks. We're going to run the 20-yard, the 30-yard back, and then you don't stop till you do the lines. You guys know what that is, right? You do the 10-yard, the 20. You do the lines, and you don't stop till you hear the whistle blow. So I'm doing the lines, 10 yards, 20 yards, 30 yards back. Whistle doesn't blow. I'm listening for the whistle. The whistle doesn't blow. I end up and I have to go the full length of the field, and I'm running towards Highway 50. And he did this to a couple people. And then he blows the whistle, and I'm turning around, and I'm like 50 yards from the field. He was trying to teach us something. He was trying to teach us to run and not be anticipating when is it time to stop. He was trying to teach us to run with the blinders on, run. And it also reminds me of, I thought of hopefully everybody has seen this movie, Forrest Gump, right? It chronicles through time. And there's this scene where the college team, the college that he goes to, discovers he can run fast, and the coach gets him and puts him on the team. They put the ball in his hands, and there's that iconic scene where he's running through all these people, and the camera shoots on his face, and he's got this straight face, and he's no emotion, just running straight up like this. Nobody's distracted him, straight, and he zigzags across the field. And what happens? The coach says, "Run, run." And remember, if you know the movie, his mom told him at a young age, "Run, Forrest, run." So that's just, he's running. He's not going to stop. He's being told to run by his coach. He's going to run. And he runs, and he makes a touchdown. And the field, he keeps going. And he runs through the tunnel, and he keeps running. And the coach makes some funny comment about that kid's crazy or whatever. But that's what comes to mind, the kind of focus, running till the whistle blows. My coach was trying to teach us something deeper than just tormenting us on the football field. He was teaching us we're not done until we till he said stop. He's the coach. He was the authority. And we're not done till God says stop. You know the whistle hasn't blown yet for you, for us? Because we're not dead, right? Everybody in this room is breathing, right? So we're not dead yet. So we know the whistle hasn't blown yet, right? So when the runner runs, and I guess you can find a funny video somewhere of somebody doing this where they think the line is somewhere else. But when the runner runs and he sees the tape in front of him and he doesn't slow down, I'm almost there, just jog to. He runs full blast through the tape, right? Because he knows the race isn't over until he breaks that line of that tape. And for us, the race isn't over until that whistle blows. And like I said, we know the whistle hasn't blown yet because we're still here. We're still breathing. Don't quit. God is holding the clock. And you remember that verse about the cloud of witnesses? The cloud of witnesses are cheering us on. Let's look at Hebrews 12:1. Hebrews 12:1. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. I'm going to read something to you, a flash from the past. I was going to have Mr. Wilford read it because I know you like to read poetry, but I didn't want to drop it on you right before, so I'll read it. 1988. This is lyrics. This is a lyric sheet from a song from Steve Green from 1988. 1988, we just got married. I'd flash a picture of it. We've got one somewhere. Of us right when we got married. We were going to show it on our anniversary day, but I forgot. We were young. We got married at 18 and 19. Or is it 19 and 20? 19 and 20. I was 19, she was 20. 1988, this song was written by Steve Green. So I'm going to read it to you. You'll know it as you start to hear it. I'm not going to sing it. I have the microphone, but I don't have the gift. Okay. We are pilgrims of the journey, of the narrow road. All those who've gone before us line the way, cheering on the faithful, encouraging the weary. Their lives a stirring testament to God's sustaining grace. Surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us run the race not only for the prize, but as those who have gone before us. Let us leave to those behind us the heritage of faithfulness passed on through godly lives. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful. May the fire of our devotion light their way. May the footprints that we leave lead them to believe, and the lives that we inspire them to obey. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful. Can you hear the tune in your head? Do you know the song? Verse 2. After all our hopes and dreams have come and gone, and our children sift through all we've left behind, may the clues that they discover and the memories that they uncover become the light that leads them to the road which we must find. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful. So I'm going to close with this last piece of Revelation. From Revelation chapter 21, verse 3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He dwells with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and the death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. So we must go until the whistle blows, right? That's our challenge. What it means to be found faithful. Let's go ahead and go to the Lord in prayer.